Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Today's video, I'm finally answering the question as to is baptism via sprinkling, or that's kind of like the water on the head, is that a valid baptism? And so this is the question that was posed to me. But before I could get to this question, in my previous video, I wanted to talk about how I believe the baptism or washing mentioned in the book of Ezekiel was a prophecy of the sacrament of baptism in the New Testament. And the main reason I wanted to do that first is because in order to answer this question about is sprinkling a valid baptism, one of the proof texts I want to use is Ezekiel 36. And so we first had to establish that Ezekiel 36 is actually talking about the sacrament of baptism and not some other kind of ritual washing. Now, that's not going to be my only argument and proof text for the idea that sprinkling is a valid baptism. We're also going to look at history and one other Bible verse, but that is particularly in relation to the actual word baptism. So basically this whole argument is that there are some churches, like your more Baptist churches and that believe in order for a baptism to be valid, there needs to be a full immersion of the individual underwater. And that just splashing water on the head or sprinkling does not count as a valid baptism. However, as Lutherans, we argue that, yes, it is a valid baptism. And the first argument for this is a practical argument. There is then the second argument, which is more the spiritual argument. So let's first look at the practical side here. So, firstly, the practical side. In the historic Catholic Church, and when I say Catholic Church, I don't mean like Roman Catholics, I just mean like the one universal church on earth, baptism has been performed in many different ways. The most common being full immersion or the sprinkling of water on the head. Normally 3 times, once for the Father, once for the Son, and once for the Holy Spirit. Although you don't need that, you could just do it once. The idea of 3 sprinklings is more just a symbolic. In the same way that sometimes when people do full immersion, they might dunk you once, or they might dunk you once for the Father, once for the Son, and once for the Holy Spirit. You don't need to be dunked 3 times, it's more of a symbolic just representation of the Trinity. As long as the water is applied to you once, that's the valid part of baptism. And in the earliest record we have of this practice of sprinkling actually goes back to the Didache, a document known as the Teaching of the 12. Some claim it was written by the 12 themselves, others claim it was just written by like the disciples of the 12 apostles who were reflecting the teachings of the apostles. Didache being a Greek word meaning teaching. So it may not have been written by the apostles themselves, but this document is meant to reflect the teachings of the 12 apostles. And so the dating of this document is somewhat debated, but it is mostly dated somewhere around the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century. Which would then make it a little bit harder for the 12 apostles to write it, though if it is written in the end of the 1st century, around like the 90s AD, then the apostle John, the son of Zebedee, would still actually be alive at this point in time. So maybe he could have written it, or at least he may have known of it or had an oversight of it. We don't know the exact details. All we know is that this document is written early on by Christians, and that if not written by the apostles, it is at least claimed that this document represents the views of the apostles. And in this document, it discusses baptism. And in chapter 7 particularly, it mentions that the preferred method of baptism is full immersion. But not just full immersion anywhere. The actual instructions that the Didache gives us is full immersion in running water, as it calls it, live water, and so a river. The text then goes to say, if you don't have running water around, then, use still water. Go baptize in a pond or a lake or a dam. And if you don't have cold water available, well, just warm water is sufficient. Use some warm water. And then the text says, lastly, if you can't do any of these things, then pouring water on their head 3 times in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit would be sufficient. So actually, we have our answer right there. The early church Christians, whether the apostles themselves or those who were taught by the apostles in the turn of the 1st century, so 1900 plus years ago, told us, yes, the preferred method is full immersion, but sprinkling on the head is still a valid method. So full immersion may be preferred, but the early church said that sprinkling on the head was a valid baptism. And so you may ask now, well, why do you Lutherans still do sprinkling if, you know, full immersion is the preferred method? Well, because, for one reason, if it's the preferred method, then it's adiaphora. We're free to do it either way. If a sprinkling is not an invalid method, then we can do it. And so it very much comes down to the views of the people being baptized, or in the case of children, what do the parents want? Do the parents want a full immersion, or do the parents want to just do the sprinkling on the head? It's an adiaphora. We can do either way. There is also, in some places like France, for example, I know a pastor over there who will only do sprinkling, and he does that because France is a very Calvinist country, and they claim that if you don't baptize through full immersion, then it's not a valid baptism. And so he deliberately will not do full immersion and only do the sprinkling as a way of defying them and saying, no, this is a valid baptism. This is similar to how in some Lutheran churches there was debate over whether white wine was valid wine for Holy Communion, and there was a big argument over whether communion had to be red wine or white wine, and those churches that said it was an adiaphora, there are some churches today that will only ever use white wine to insist that white wine does not invalidate the sacrament. And so they won't use red wine because they're trying to make a theological point. And so sometimes Lutherans will tend to stick with the sprinkling and avoid immersion baptism because we want to reinforce this idea that sprinkling, while it may not be the historically preferred method of the church, it is still a valid method. And therefore, we are going to do it so that we can say to all those Baptists, you can't call our baptisms invalid. It's a kind of, it is an adiaphora practice, but that we have to do a particular practice to make a theological point. Now, there were actually in the early church as well debate over whether sprinkling was a valid baptism. And about 150 years after the Didache was written, so we're looking like the mid 200s, so like 250s, sometime around there, there was a, although noted small but still significant, debate over the mode of baptism. And so there were some people already in the early church who started saying, I don't think sprinkling is a valid baptism. And the Bishop of Carthage, St. Cyprian, declared that the divine benefits can in no respect be manipulated or weakened by the mode of sprinkling. For in the sacrament of salvation, the contagion of skin is not washed away like the filth of the skin. And if that seems a little confusing, what Cyprian is saying is like, look, when you get baptism, it's not the water that actually saves you. The water is just simply a means through which the Holy Spirit is applied to you, and it is the Holy Spirit who brings you the gifts of God which saves you. Therefore, he's saying it doesn't really matter if the water is a full immersion or a sprinkling, because you're not actually getting your skin washed. You're not being saved because you had a bath. You're being saved by the Holy Spirit bringing you the gifts of grace. The water is simply a means of grace through which the Holy Spirit comes to you. Therefore, the mode doesn't matter. And as so Cyprian says, the divine benefits, the gifts of baptism, the validity of baptism is not manipulated or weakened through the form of sprinkling. So So again, if we just look at the historical practices of the church, we have in the first century, the turn of the first century, when just as the apostles are dying off and the second generation of Christians are now taking over, they say, look, yes, full immersion is preferred, but sprinkling is fully valid. Then about 150 years later, or was 150? Yeah. Then about 150 years later, you get a small group of Christians popping up and saying, we don't think sprinkling is valid, and they get quickly shut down by Cyprian, who says, no, sprinkling is a valid method. So we just have the pure historical fact that the church has always considered sprinkling to be a valid baptism. Now let us look at what the Bible actually says about baptism and whether sprinkling is a valid method. And to do that, we're going to look at the word baptism itself. Baptism means wash. There are those who support the idea of a full immersion as the only form of valid baptism. They'll say, no, baptism means full immersion. And they'll say, the word for wash in Greek is nipto. And they'll say, like when you wash your hands, you don't have to necessarily fully immerse them, and that word is nipto, but when you wash something through baptism, that is a full immersion. That is actually incorrect. People will claim that, but that's not correct. Nipto doesn't actually mean wash. It means cleanse. Yes, it can sometimes be then used as a synonym for wash, but the word itself literally means to make something clean. Baptism does literally just mean wash. And there is nothing in the word that would imply a full immersion has to take place. And the best argument for this comes from Mark chapter 7, verse 4, where Jesus refers to the Pharisees washing, baptizo, their cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Now, yes, things like cups, pitchers, copper vessels, plates, and stuff like that, yeah, you could fully immerse them in a sink. But nobody, I tell you, nobody was fully immersing a couch. Particularly back in the Roman era when couches were often these big heavy things made out of hay and straw. No one with 2 brain cells to rub together would take a big heavy hay couch, take it down to the local river, fully immerse it, take it out soaking wet, and then have to take it home. No, the way they wash their couches is that they normally got a bit of water on a cloth and wiped them down, like we do today often. And so we can see from that baptism does not necessarily mean full immersion. It simply means wash. Because no one in their right mind would fully immerse a hay couch. They would wash it by wiping it down with water. Which demonstrates that the word baptizo just means washing with water and could be either a full immersion or just a sprinkling of water on. And now, lastly, we come to the point I made previously, which is my previous video on Ezekiel's baptism. In my previous video, I established how the washing that Ezekiel speaks about in Ezekiel 36 is a prophecy of the coming baptism, or the coming sacrament of baptism. And what does Ezekiel say? Does he say, I will fully immerse you with water? He says, no, God gives this promise. I will sprinkle you with water. And as I mentioned in my previous video, I'm not the first person to apply Ezekiel 36 to baptism. Many church fathers and reformers did so as well. And Ezekiel mentions washing through sprinkling. That God was able to cleanse the people of Israel through a sprinkling with water. Therefore, we can see from the scriptures that sprinkling is a valid baptism. So, I hope all that helps answer the question. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.